Hello and thank you for joining us. I'm Ben Sheen, a managing editor here at Stratfor, and I'm joined today by John Minnich, East Asia analyst, and we'll be talking a little bit about Japan. So John, there's a lot of talk in the press at the moment based on the fact that Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is here in America talking with President Obama, talking about the relationship between the US and Japan. But actually it goes a little bit deeper than that, doesn't it, in terms of what Japan's been doing in the modern world in context?
What we've been watching recently in Japan is that in some sense, Japan is on the verge or in the process of attempting a national revival. And that's both an economic revival. So we see that with Shinzo Abe's economic revival program called Abenomics, an economic revival program that's designed to essentially take Japan out of the stagnancy that it's been kind of mired in for the last 2 decades and begin to, add some kind of vibrancy into the Japanese economy. But it's not just an economic program. Abe is attempting a broader revival in the sense of also reformulating Japan's diplomatic position within East Asia and very significantly boosting Japan's both military capabilities, but also, in some ways more importantly, its autonomy, its freedom of movement. And this ultimately is approaching what we call the normalization of the Japanese military. Japan can wield its military forces as other nations do, in a certain sense. So that's kind of the background to Abe's visit to the United States. And they're working on both economic cooperation, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership is kind of the centerpiece of that U.S.-Japan economic cooperation. It's part of a region-wide multilateral free trade agreement, but also defense cooperation. That's a very significant element in this. And this goes back to something that actually Stratfor is working on right now. It's a kind of a broader reassessment of where Japan is today and where we see Japan going. And Stratfor has this kind of long-time working assessment, working forecast for Japan that we do see Japan, in a certain sense, that the status quo of the last 20 years, which is relative foreign policy introversion and economic stagnancy, that this status quo is unsustainable for a variety of reasons. And we see internal compulsions that are driving Japan towards changing. And the key there would be, when we talk about economic stagnancy, a big component of that is the hollowing out of a lot of the industries that used to be the driving force of the Japanese economy. And a result of that is rising underemployment, weak consumption, things like that. But another component of the internal compulsions driving Japan forward is demographic change, which is a long-term process that will play out over the course of decades, but is nonetheless a kind of slow-burning background noise pressure on the Japanese leadership, on Japanese policymakers. And then there's the other element, which is the external pressures on Japan. There are sort of 2 key external pressures driving Japan forward. One is in a broad sense, the rise of China. Stratfor is actually skeptical of the reality or the real trajectory of Chinese power, economic, military, and diplomatic power and influence in East Asia because of internal fissures we identify in the Chinese economy. But also, for Japanese policymakers, they're responding to what is a very real threat in some sense. I mean, China is growing, it is becoming more powerful, and policymakers are responding to that. The other component of this idea of the internal and external forces driving Japan to reformulate its behavior is the shift in American strategy. So we see the U.S. moving towards what could be described as a more mature balance of power grand strategy, where instead of intervening directly to maintain the balance in different regions of the world, the U.S. relies more heavily on regional partners. And in the case of East Asia, with the rise of China, Japan then becomes far more significant for the U.S. as a regional partner in defense cooperation.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the fact that we're actually taking this deeper look into Japan as an entity, because we had a lot of reader responses on the Geopolitical Weekly that you wrote, and people were asking, well, what about the US balance of power? What about the threat from China? What about the aging population in Japan? And really, this study gets to the core of all these things. There was one question I wanted to ask you, though. A lot of people are talking about TPP. What is it, and why is it important?
So the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a 12-country, essentially region-wide Asia-Pacific free trade agreement, and it serves a number of purposes. I mean, the core idea here is to expand region-wide trade and investment flows, and that has both economic benefits for the countries involved, but also serves a geopolitical purpose. I mean, there is some sense in which the Trans-Pacific Partnership is intended to constrain China or contain China. We have China is a rising economic power in the region. China is also, in the process of establishing its own, sets of rules and regulations, trying to build its own bilateral partnerships in the region, trying to expand its influence in a broad sense. And TPP is, in some sense, designed to hedge against that process. So it is, and when we talk about this idea of Japan and the U.S. moving around to kind of contain or constrain China, TPP would represent the diplomatic and economic aspect of that. Now, for Japan, though, domestically, it also plays back and has it's significant domestically because we see Japan in the process right now of attempting to, as it seeks to break from the economic stagnancy of the last 2 decades. Well, one important component of that is implementing reforms that increase economic competition at home. And therefore, in theory at least, and the hope is that by increasing foreign competition, but also just competition in general within the Japanese economy, it will improve productivity, improve efficiency, improve innovation. And these are things that the Abe administration sees as critical, not only for, in the general sense of bringing Japan back to economic growth, but bringing it back to economic growth for the end of enabling Japan to achieve its longer-term regional diplomatic and military imperatives vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis other security threats that are coming up.
And it seems to me that's been the tricky part at the core of the study, which is we're not just looking 10 years out, we're looking potentially for the rest of the century and seeing how Japan is going to continue on its arc, really. And certainly I'm really looking forward, I'm sure as our readers are, to seeing the fruits of that project actually reach fruition.
Exactly. The Weekly is part of a longer-term project that we're working on, which is not just understanding how Japan operates today or how it's going to operate in the next 5 years, but really thinking about, Japan it's in some sense fallen from the international relations limelight in the last 2 or 3 years as the rise of China and various other things have kind of, absorbed Americans' attention in particular. But we have to remember that Japan, despite 2 decades of essentially not growing, Japan remains the world's 3rd largest economy. This is a very significant player, not only within East Asia, but globally. And if we see Japan attempting a national revival in response to these internal and external pressures we've described, then that's something that we really need to take into account. We need to integrate into our long-term forecast. We need to understand how that's going to cooperate or rub against, for instance, the way we see China evolving, Russia evolving, North Korea evolving. All of these internal processes are going to come together to create both a far more competitive, but in many ways also far more exciting region in East Asia over the coming several decades.
Very much so. And John, thank you so much for giving us an insight into what's been consuming you for a lot of these most recent months as well.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. For more on this interesting topic, please continue to read stratfor.com.